about lessons. I'm going to be speaking about lessons from sisterhood. Specifically within that, I want to talk to you about the harvest. And I'll be using two texts in the book of Ruth, Ruth chapter 1, verses 16 through 18, and Ruth 4, verses 14 through 15. But I'm also going to kind of skip around. And they say to stick with what you know, so I'm going to follow that advice. I'm a screenwriter, so I'm going to illustrate tonight with a screenplay. And I wanted to use an example that people would be familiar with, but because we don't always know what story God is writing in our lives, I'm not going to tell you what movie it's from. And I also realize that people may have dialed in and so they can't see the screen. So I'll also just, I'll read it and then you guys can just throw out your guesses. Hopefully it's not too easy. And also the excerpt has a character's name in it, so I've redacted it. So name that story. His body spasms, fighting against the thick gelatin. Metal tubes, surreal versions of hospital tubes, obscure his face. Other lines like IVs are connected to limbs and cover his genitals. He is struggling desperately now. Air bubbles into the jello, but does not break the surface. Pressing up, the surface distends, stretching like a red rubber cocoon. Unable to breathe, he fights wildly to stand, clawing at the thinning elastic shroud until it ruptures, a hole widening around his mouth as he sucks for air. Tearing himself free, he emerges from the cell. He is bald and naked, his body slick with gelatin. Dizzy, nauseous, he waits for his vision to focus. He is standing in an oval capsule of clear alloy filled with magenta gelatin, the surface of which has solidified like curdled milk. The IVs in his arms are plugged into outlets that appear to be grafted to his flesh. He feels the weight of another cable and reaches to the back of his head, where he finds an enormous coaxial plugged and locked into the base of his skull. He tries to pull it out, but it will be easier to pull off a finger. To either side, he sees other tube-shaped pods filled with gelatin. Beneath the wax-like surface, pale and motionless, he sees other human beings. Fanning out in a circle, there are more, all connected to a center core, each capsule like a red, dimly glowing petal attached to a black metal stem. Above him, level after level, the stem rises, seemingly forever. He moves to the foot of the capsule and looks out. The image assaults his mind. All right. Is there any guesses as to what this is from?
The Matrix.
Man, I made it too easy. Yes, it's The Matrix by the Wachowski brothers. And it's the scene where Neo wakes up on the Nebuchadnezzar Morpheus' ship. And his mind, of course, is blowing because he's obviously never seen these pods of beings that are being used like batteries for energy. But we're going to put a pin in this and come back to this page of the script later. It's just one of a couple of different excerpts that I'm going to use, but you can definitely read the script in its entirety at another time. I've included the web address at the bottom. Let me broaden this a little bit. I don't think you can see it. Okay. All right. And I can also throw that in the chat too. But there's so many different ways to tell a story. So even within screenwriting, there's different types. Most people just use the word script, but there are technically differences. So like a screenplay is for a film, a teleplay is for a TV show. They generally have the same formatting rules, vary in some cases. So various mediums have various rules. And the way that you tell a story in a novel is obviously very different than you would for like a short story, because in a novel you have time. The reader is prepared to take a journey with you that could last for hundreds of pages. So you can take your time as the writer describing the setting and what the character is feeling and thinking. But in television, you don't have that luxury. The audience wants it fast. If something, odd or exciting doesn't happen the first 2 minutes, they're watching something else. Generally, the job of any writer, though, is to take you on a journey, like an entertaining one. But as a Christian writer, my job is to take people on a journey where they can meet God. Huge difference. So I personally look to the Bible as the greatest reference. And I really got a lot out of reading about Ruth and Naomi. It's a very, very rich story. I like how the story begins, how it's introduced. And we can look at an example of an introduction. I've included the opening words of the matrix on the screen, and it opens with, the code for the matrix, columns of green numbers rolling, and it says fade in, which is generally how you begin any script. Fade in, on computer screen, so close it has no boundaries. A blinding cursor pulses in the electric darkness like a heart coursing with phosphorus light, burning beneath the derma of black neon glass. A phone begins to ring. We hear it as though we were making the call. The cursor continues to throb, relentlessly patient until. So those are the opening words of the script. And then, of course, later at the beginning of The Matrix, we have this scene with Trinity. She enters the Matrix and she has this chase scene with Agent Smith, and he's chasing her over these rooftops, and he rams a truck into the phone booth that she's using to contact Morpheus's ship. So all of it's written in a way that really grabs our attention in the first few minutes. The Book of Ruth also opens with something that gets our attention. It definitely gets the attention of the characters. 3 men die, and they have family left behind who mourn them. Ruth 1 starts, "Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. So the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband." That's Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. So something tragic has happened, and we get introduced to 2 of the 3 major characters that we'll be covering, Ruth and Naomi. I think it's really interesting how both Ruth and Naomi are.
Carly, sorry, I think you're on mute.
Oh no, okay. Where did you guys last hear me speaking?
Introducing Ruth and Orpah, I think.
Did you hear me read Ruth 1 through 5?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Oh yeah, so I think it's interesting how both Ruth and Naomi are introduced. In screenwriting, we have cues in the script to the reader when a character is important, like the main character. And that's the person who you're going to be going on that journey with. So we're going to look at how the main character in The Matrix was introduced in the script. This is the first scene in Neo's apartment, and the script says, "It is a studio apartment that seems overgrown with technology. Weed-like cables coil everywhere, duct-taped into thickets that wind up and around the legs of several desks. Tabletops are filled with cannibalized equipment that lay open like an autopsied corpse. At the center of this technological rat nest is Neo, a man who knows more about living inside a computer than outside one." Okay, so we're told a few things. We're told about the space, and then we find Neo at the center of what the writers call a technological rat nest. And we know Neo's important because of the way he's introduced. It's a pretty in-depth description because it directly ties into where the story is going. We're told that he's a man who knows more about living inside a computer than outside one. And so when we read the rest of the script or we watch the movie, we'll find out that being the quote unquote, the one requires someone who can beat computer programming. So Neo is well suited for this task. We're also told things about Ruth that tell us where her story is going. When we meet her in chapter 1, before we get her name, we're told she's a wife in verse 4. During those times, a woman's identity was directly connected to either her husband, a son, or father, a male figure. She didn't have rights in and of herself. And if a woman is named in the Bible, then she's important. She's doing something really great. So we find out she's a wife, and then we find out that her name is Ruth. Like Neo, we'll find out that Ruth is suited for the task God has for her. And that's because she's loyal and she listens to the wise counsel of others. So let's pick back up where we left off with Ruth's story. So after all this tragedy, Naomi is just utterly broken. She's lost her husband, her sons, and she wants to go home. She's heard that the famine has ended back in the land of Judah. There's bread there now, and so that looks like the move. Initially, she takes her two daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth, but she tells them to leave, go back to your mother's houses, is what she says. And Naomi asks in chapter 1, verses 12 and 13, if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? Naomi saying, look, it's just not really practical for you to stay with me. I'm not your best shot at getting security, at finding another man which society deems necessary for you to have rights and a home. And not only does Naomi not have sons to offer, but she thinks that she herself is putting them at a disadvantage. She says that the Lord's hand has gone out against her. So this is a woman who is truly, truly broken in spirit. Orpah goes back, but Ruth refuses. She says in verse 16, entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. Those are some strong words to say that you'll leave all that you know behind. And so when Naomi sees Ruth isn't budging, she just stops talking. She stops trying to convince her, and they go on to Bethlehem together. When Ruth gets there, a few things happen. We immediately see that there's some provision. She gets a job. They're arriving at the beginning of the barley harvest, a time when crops are ripe for picking, much different than the land of famine that it had once been. Naomi has a relative there named Boaz. He's described as a man with great wealth of the family of Elimelech. Ruth asks Naomi if she can go work in the fields, picking up heads of grain after him, and what she says, in whose sight I may find favor. That's in Ruth 2, 1-2. And Naomi tells her, go. She encourages her to go. Ruth goes. And while she's out there, she comes to a field that belongs to Boaz. And he's there. And we know he's a man of God. The book of Ruth is the first place he's mentioned in the Bible. And when we meet him, the first words out of his mouth are, the Lord be with you. He says this to the reapers who are working in the harvest of his fields. And then he sees Ruth and he asks his workers, whose young woman is this? And they tell him about Ruth's connection to Naomi. And so he looks out for her. He tells her, keep working, stay with the women who work the fields. And that he's commanded all of the men out there not to lay a finger on her. He tells her, if you're thirsty, drink from the water that my workers have drawn up. So he's offering her work and protection and provision while she's out there. And Ruth asks him, she says, why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me since I'm a foreigner? I want to talk a little bit about being a foreigner. Ruth was from Moab, a nation of people that were outside of God's covenant, and they were known for practicing incest. In accordance with God's word that he gave to the prophets, Moab would be gradually declining over time. Even though the land itself was well adapted for pasturing. Geographically, Moab was closed in by the Dead Sea on the west side, the desert on the east, the kingdom of Edom on the north, and its plateau on the north was hedged in by a large valley called the Arnon. So all of this land to pasture, but obviously the people weren't abundant in spirit. In Amos chapter 2, verses 1-2, it pronounces the death sentence on Moab. And in Isaiah chapters 15 and 16, it talks about the burden of Moab and its coming destruction. So Ruth is from a place that we now know just didn't have a very bright history. By contrast, Bethlehem was in hill country. And during Jacob's time, it was referred to as Ephrath, which means fruitful. Now, in the Old Testament, God was always just very, very intentional about separating his people from the rest of the world. He didn't want Israel marrying and having children with people from other lands who were serving other gods, who weren't living in ways that he was pleased with. So the fact that this woman, Ruth, is willing to give up her people and presumably their customs, that would be favored in God's sight. She says in chapter 1 to Naomi, your people shall be my people. That's huge. And we know that God can call people out away from their families and their land for great work. Like he called Abram out before his name was changed to Abraham. He called him away from his family who was worshiping the stars in Genesis 12. So certain things always go along with being called by God. There's protection and there's purpose. Ruth was willing to join God's people, and God switched her location with provision. Let's go back to some screenwriting notes. So we were talking about God switching Ruth's location. In screenwriting, when we want to change locations, we use what are called scene headings. They appear as either EXT, which stands for exterior, and outside shot, or INT, interior and indoor shot. So they're directions for production of where to shoot the scene, inside or outside. Here's an example of a scene heading from The Matrix. It identifies that we're outside of a window using exterior. And then below, we have a couple of lines that are called action. The writers use the sentences in the action section to describe what the window or the external location looks like to orient the reader. And then, of course, it would just go on to tell what happens. But we want to be able to imagine where we are. So you'll notice the first sentence here isn't a complete sentence. It says, a yellow glow in the midst of a dark brick building. Okay, but the yellow glow does what? There's no verb. If you were to turn this into your teacher in like elementary school, you may get a C- or something for not writing complete sentences. But in screenwriting, it's perfectly acceptable. It's about being as detailed as possible in as little space as possible. And so scripts are just littered with incomplete sentences. And the action lines that follow a scene heading shouldn't just be repeating what the scene heading says. So had the writers have said, a window filled with a yellow glow, instead of just saying a yellow glow, people would say that you're not a very good screenwriting writer. And obviously they are. So the action line following a scene heading should further define where we are or what's happening. And it should be enough, just enough to be informative, which is honestly kind of how God works. Sometimes he doesn't tell us when we're about to move, we don't get any notice, or at least it doesn't feel that way. And sometimes he'll give us just enough details for us to keep reading, for us to keep paying attention to what's happening in our own story. In our own lives, do our action lines further define our location? When God puts us someplace, maybe it's not someplace we ever foresaw ourselves, we don't want to be there, but what is your disposition towards that place when you're there? What are you doing in your actions that can either make or break you in that situation? Are you being a good steward of the protection and provision that God is providing while you're supposed to be there, acting out his purpose? What would the scene heading in Ruth's story look like? So some things happened in the text that shifted Naomi and Ruth's location. There was the famine. That was the reason why Naomi and her family were in Moab. And then there were the deaths of Naomi's husband and sons. But the famine had ended in Bethlehem, so that's what sent Naomi back home. Things were starting to look up. Her scene heading went from exterior, Moab, night, to exterior, Bethlehem, day. And I say night and day, not in the literal sense, like you would trying to tell people whether to shoot during the day or at night, the scenes of a movie, but because she left Moab in dark, tragic circumstances, but then thrived in Bethlehem under a bright future, a place that would later be where David kept his father's sheep, and would later be the birthplace of Christ. So God not only changed her location, but he changed her situation. Okay, so I told you guys we were going to return to this excerpt from the Matrix script. One of the things I just absolutely love about the craft of screenwriting is that sometimes we as writers, we get to play directors. Yes, the director has the vision and people heed that vision, more so in film than television. In film, directors are king, but in television, writers have a lot more control over the story. Either way, a writer can move you through a scene visually, even when they aren't behind the camera. You can do this by the order in which we describe something. So here the writers move us from close to Neo, or tied on as the industry calls it, and then we go further out or wide to what's around him. We don't see the seemingly infinite number of human pods when the scene first opens. All we know is that Neo is in this weird gelatin and he's just got all these like weird tubes hooked up to him. And we may not even know it's Neo, honestly. So in our own lives, sometimes we don't see the bigger picture. There could be traps, dangers, things that would absolutely blow our mind if we knew about them. But are we allowing God to be the director of our production, letting him move us closer to or farther away from those things along our path that we may not see? And so you can sort of reflect on that, all of these little questions that I've inserted, and we can comment about them later. But let's pick back up with the story. So after Ruth finds favor in Boaz's sight, while she's working the barley harvest, she comes home with all this grain and she tells Naomi what Boaz did for her. And Naomi approves. She encourages her. She says, Ruth, heed Boaz's words. In Ruth chapter 2, verse 20, Naomi says, blessed be he of the Lord who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead. The man is a relation of ours, one of our close relatives. And Ruth continues working the harvest until the end of the season. The text says in chapter 2, verse 23, until the end of the barley harvest and wheat season, barley harvest and wheat harvest. But remember, both of these women are grieving. Ruth is grieving, but she's working fields. She's hard at work, even in her grief. And Naomi is directing her. She's showing her how to move in this environment. She says, heed Boaz's words because he's a close relative. This is how things are done. She tells Ruth in chapter 3, verses 1-4, my daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you? Now Boaz, whose young women you were with, is he not a relative? In fact, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Therefore wash yourself and anoint yourself. Put on your best garment and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Then it shall be, when he lies down, that you notice the place where he lies. And you shall go in, uncover his feet, and lie down. And he will tell you what you should do. So Ruth hears this. And what does she do? She's obedient. She says in verse 5 to Naomi, all that you say to me, I will do. So she went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law instructed her. So Ruth goes down to the threshing floor at night. Boaz has just finished eating and drinking, so he's cheerful. And he lays down at the end of the grain heap. And then Ruth comes over and uncovers his feet, and she lies down. But it scares Boaz. Verses 8-9 say, now it happened at midnight that the man was startled and turned himself, and there a woman was lying at his feet. And he said, who are you? So she answered, I am Ruth, your maidservant. Take your maidservant under your wing, for you are a close relative. She says, take your maidservant under your wing. The word wing, as it's used here, is the Hebrew word kanaf. It's defined as wing, extremity, edge, border, corner, or shirt. It's the same word that Boaz used back in chapter 2, verse 10, after Ruth asked, why have I found favor in your sight, even though I'm a foreigner? And so he responds in verse 12, they're saying, the Lord repay your work and a full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. So there Boaz is referring to God's wings. The Bible uses imagery of God's wings all the time. It's in various places throughout scriptures. One of my favorites is in Psalms 94:1. It says, he shall cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you shall take refuge. His truth shall be your shield and buckler. So I said earlier about how when God calls you out from a place, it's for a purpose, and there's intentionality in the way that he does that. He's thought through what you're going to be exposed to, what the resources are, where they're coming from. Ruth got there and she got a job. And when, it was when her and Naomi didn't have a man in the house to provide or for protection. And then she was later given a husband and a child, and we'll get to that. But there was order in the way that God did that, similar to Adam in Genesis. First Adam was there, he got a job, and then he was, provided with a helpmate. There's always levels, stages to the way that God does things. So Boaz is talking about the Almighty's protection when he uses wings here. But later, when Ruth uses it at his feet on the threshing floor, she's talking about Boaz's protection. Because God is a God of intentionality, there's always protection and his protection, and then there would be a husband's protection beneath that. But God's is first and foremost, which is honestly great news for women who are traveling alone in foreign territory, perhaps without the protection of men during that time. So I believe that Ruth is talking about marriage here, but she has also already experienced God's protection first. So we're told that when Ruth uncovers Boaz's feet, he became afraid. And we're told that he's afraid before he actually sees anyone. Why? We don't know if Boaz was already asleep when Ruth uncovered his feet, or if he was, then if he was awake, then it would make sense that he wouldn't notice that. But if he was already asleep, what was it? Was there a draft? Did he feel a presence? In our own lives, are we sometimes afraid of what God has for us? Something happens, we can't quite put our finger on it. We can't quite make it all out in the dark, or sort of like the haziness of our lives. Ruth was ultimately a gift to him, but Boaz didn't quite know what he was looking at in that moment in the dark. And I would just say to men on the call, maybe God has presented you with a gift. Maybe it made you afraid. Maybe you didn't know what to do with it, how to treat it, how to treat her. Boaz was initially afraid, but we'll see that later he did the right thing. So Boaz followed the custom of that day, which was Hebrew law. It was outlined in Deuteronomy 25:5. It says, if brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. Her husband's brother shall go into her, take her as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. So we know that Boaz later in Ruth chapter 4, beginning verse 1, that he went and he followed this custom by first offering Naomi's land inheritance to another relative. But he stipulated that if that man took it, he also had to take on Ruth as well. And so that man declines, and Boaz, knowing that he's next in line, he says before witnesses that he will take the land and take on Ruth as his wife. So he does. He takes Ruth as his wife, and then they conceive a son in Ruth 4:13. And the women celebrate. In Ruth 4, verses 14 and 15, it says, the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel, and may he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has borne him. What a beautiful statement. Naomi believes that Ruth is better than 7 sons. And remember, sons back then were huge. It meant security in your old age, prosperity, since daughters wouldn't have rights in and of themselves. So having Ruth, she says, is better than 7 of these. And with God, you really don't need a whole lot. And so the son that Ruth bore with Boaz, named Obed, links her to Christ. Obed is the grandfather of David. And so this story takes place within salvation history. In Ruth 4:11, women of Bethlehem asked that God make Ruth fruitful, quote, like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. And they say, may you prosper in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Lord will give you from this young woman. So Ruth is in a line of very influential women. And in this story, all of this was possible because the characters were allowing God to be the author and the directors of their lives. So in conclusion, I really think the story of Ruth and Naomi is the story about harvest. What happens during a harvest? It's a time of bountiful crops. They're being plucked. People can finally benefit from their labor and what God has allowed to grow and flourish. And these 2 women did flourish. They reaped good fruit from what looked like barren circumstances. The circumstances in Ruth and Naomi's introduction weren't ideal. Ruth only met Naomi because her family left their home in Bethlehem after God caused a famine. So there was famine, there was death, but God lifted the famine. Then Bethlehem was then this attractive place to return to. So God was sort of working some things out. Some things still needed to change. Ruth needed to meet Boaz. And Ruth was well suited for the purpose that God had for her. From a worldly perspective, Ruth had a better shot if she stayed in Moab. But she was someone who let God dictate her surroundings. And she did this by using wisdom and listening to people who were wise, like Naomi and Boaz. So you never really know where God is taking you. You may feel like you're wandering through unfamiliar territory, but will you allow God to play the director in your life? Ruth did, and she was loyal and became a part of an important lineage. She moved, but her loyalty stayed in place. And we get loyalty from other characters, not just Ruth. From Naomi. Naomi was a pusher. She was someone who just pushed through even when it hurt. She arrived back in Bethlehem utterly heartbroken, but that didn't keep her from kicking it into gear when she saw that Ruth needed guidance. And so this woman is grieving a husband and her sons, but was able to put Ruth before her grief and steer Ruth to gaining those very things that she herself had lost. Can we be people who are able to do that, who can set aside what we're going through to help others? Or will we be consumed with anger or resentment or maybe fear, so much so that you can't be of use to other people? And ultimately, that means you can't be of use to God. And so the zeal with which Naomi helps Ruth really reflects sisterhood that's grounded in God's love. As to Boaz, he also showed loyalty by letting Ruth work the harvest and following through on his words about marrying her. But before Boaz even knows the role he's going to play in her life, he blesses her. He says to her in Ruth 2:12, "The Lord repay your work in a full reward." He doesn't know that he will be a part of that very blessing he's affirming, but he allowed God to be the author and director of his life. For men on the call, you never know where a woman is in her spiritual journey or what role you may be playing in it. Last thing, I said earlier that being a Christian writer is about taking people on a journey where they can meet God. I wasn't always a Christian writer. In fact, when I started, I was writing things that were definitely counter to the way that God would want us to live. But as I grew spiritually, my work transformed. God really changed me from the inside out. My work began to mirror him. He cleaned me up and gave me something different to talk about, different desire to talk about, something different. So I'm definitely proof that God can take a wanderer and give her direction. And I believe that's what he did in this text. He took two women who were wandering in their grief and gave them direction and a rich future. And when God does that for you, you really just can't help but be of service. Ruth was serving. She was serving in the fields. She was serving God's purpose without even knowing it. So let's be of service and not grow weary. As Galatians 6:9 says, "For in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart." And what happens after you sow seeds, even when you're in tears? Psalms 126:5 says, "They that sow in tears shall reap in joy." That's my lesson. Thank you guys for listening.